Hey, thanks, Sam. Carl and I are anxious to talk about exceptions and exemptions. And there was a question that we received earlier this week in connection with another program that Carl and I recently did that illustrates why this program is so essential. The person who sent the question asked, how do you define first-time borrower? Do we need documentation to evidence the first-time borrower, like tax returns to evidence no mortgage interest deduction on Schedule A? Why were they asking that? Because they're concerned about the mandatory pre-consummation homeownership counseling that applies to certain types of loans. But my response to them would be, hey, do you make any loans that involve negative amortization? Because if the answer is no, that mandatory pre-loan counseling applies only if the loan is to a first-time borrower and it may involve negative amortization. So understanding the ins and outs of the coverage rules and the exemptions will save you a lot of work. And if that banker's answer to the question is, well, no, we don't do any negative am, then my advice is you don't have to worry about what the definition of first-time borrower is because it's not going to come into play for you. So we have a boatload of new changes to the mortgage lending rules. Most of them take effect in January of 2014, but we've got some that take effect in June 1st in particular, of this year. So our advice is to take a very strategic look at the scope of each one. When you're trying to figure out how and where to spend your time, you're going to narrow it down by looking at, okay, do we make any of these types of loans? Is the loan we're dealing with in a particular situation a loan that triggers one of these requirements? And do the characteristics of our institution itself qualify us for any kind of exemption? So that's what we're going to do in this program. What you want to do is figure out what you don't have to learn. If something doesn't apply to you because you qualify for an exemption or because you don't make that kind of a loan, then you don't need to master the fine details of whatever it is. So we're going to establish a framework where it's kind of like you're throwing these regs in a colander, and you've got your scope of coverage rules. So based on the coverage rules, some types of loans are going to pass through the colander because they aren't covered. For example, if we're talking about Reg Z requirements and you've thrown a bunch of loans into the colander and some of them are business loans, those business loans are going to come right out through the holes. They aren't going to be covered because Reg Z doesn't apply to business loans. And then some loans will fall through the colander because of exceptions and exemptions, either because of you as an institution and your qualifications or because of the type of loan. So if something doesn't apply to you or your loans, who wants to waste time figuring out what the requirements would have been had you had to comply with those? The only time you might want to take a look is if you see, we're almost covered. If that's the case, then you do want to dig in and figure out when you cross the applicable threshold what you'll need to be doing. So we've broken it into 6 different steps for the task. The first is you take the requirements and prohibitions one at a time. And the reason you have to do that is because there is no universality in these rules and regs. You probably have already figured that out. So the test for exemptions and exceptions is not consistent from one to another. For example, if you look at the Reg B requirements on copies of appraisals and valuations, that's only on first lien loans secured by a dwelling, but unlike a lot of the other rules we'll be discussing, it applies regardless of the purpose of the loan or the type of borrower. On the mandatory pre-consummation home ownership counseling, you have a very narrow set of circumstances where that applies. There are only two types of loans that that are covered by the mandate for the home ownership counseling to be obtained prior to consummation. On the periodic mortgage statement, same thing. You know, you're starting with Reg Z, so you know it has to be a Reg Z covered loan, and then you dig deeper and you see, there's a small servicer exemption. What exactly is that under this particular part of Reg Z? Banker sat in on a webinar I did the other day on loan originator compensation and sent a follow-up email afterwards and said, we don't make any residential mortgage loans. Does that mean that the loan originator compensation provisions don't apply to us? Well, that's exactly what that means. The problem is that the regulators can be real loose with their verbiage. So when you hear a term like loan originator, you're thinking anybody who originates loans. So this guy at this desk over here who makes car loans, this person over here who does your commercial lending, and the fact is that the terms they use are typically specially defined terms with very finite and particular meanings. And so until you drill down to those, it's impossible to really understand the coverage. So step one is to take those requirements and prohibitions one at a time. Step two is to examine the basic coverage provisions. Everything that we're going to discuss, all of the Dodd-Frank rules that are out so far, either amend Reg Z, Reg X, or Reg B. So you know that that means particular things with respect to coverage. So you have the basic coverage that's spawned by the rule that something is within. So if it's Reg Z, it's got to be to a consumer primarily for a personal, family, or household purpose. If it's Reg X, it has slightly different ramifications. If it's Reg B, it doesn't matter, the borrower or the type of purpose. So you look at that to begin with. So once you pin down which rule is the applicable rule and grasp the ramifications of that, knowing that if it's Reg X, it has to involve a mortgage on real property upon which there is or will be located a 1 to 4 family dwelling. If it's secured by vacant land, the loan isn't covered unless there's going to be a mobile home or a dwelling placed there using the proceeds of the loan, etc. You know that if it's 25 or more acres, it's not going to be covered by RESPA because that's one of the exemptions. So a lot of things fall through the holes in the colander that way. So when it comes to your analysis, you know how they say in real estate it's location, location, location. When it comes to regulatory interpretation, it's context, context, context. You have to understand what are we talking about here. You have to put the hat on for whatever reg you're dealing with so you understand the context of the new requirements. Step 4 is when you're going through the coverage rules to ask yourself, okay, for this particular provision, does the type of borrower matter? Does it matter whether it's an individual or a business? Does the purpose of